In the spring of 1887, a discovery made by the Hartwell family beneath their farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania would go on to divide their community for decades. What they uncovered under those floorboards wasn't treasure, nor bones, nor anything that could be easily explained. It was something far more disturbing, a deliberate, methodical concealment suggesting that someone within the household had been hiding a truth so profound that an entire second structure had been built to bury it. The question that lingered with everyone who learned of it was simple yet unanswerable. What were they so desperate to conceal? And for how long had it remained hidden? Before we continue with the story of the Hartwell family and the secrets buried beneath their home, if you're listening from Pennsylvania or any of the surrounding states, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know which state you're tuning in from. And if you've ever caught wind of old family secrets in your own community, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and let's unravel this mystery together. The Hartwell property occupied 80 acres of rolling farmland near the border of Lancaster and Lebanon counties, a region where the landscape gently undulated and the forests pressed close to the cleared fields. The main house was built in 1823 by Nathaniel Hartwell, a man whose name appeared with such regularity in county records that it hinted at both prosperity and wariness. He had acquired the land from a family named Clean, who had abandoned it somewhat suddenly in 1821 after a fire destroyed their original dwelling. The Hartwell house, erected in place of the Clean structure, was constructed with stone foundations and timber framing, the kind of sturdy build intended to endure for generations. The stone foundation had been laid by masons brought in from Lancaster, skilled workers familiar with the particular challenges of building in Pennsylvania's hilly terrain. The limestone came from quarries just 10 miles away, and the workers took their time, ensuring each stone was properly fitted and that the mortar between them would hold for centuries. The timber for the frame came from the property itself, massive oak and chestnut trees felled and milled on site. The wood was aged before use, a practice becoming less common by the 1820s, but one Nathaniel Hartwell insisted upon, believing properly aged wood would resist rot and warping far better than freshly cut timber. By 1887, the house had passed through 3 generations of Hartwells. The current occupant was Thomas Hartwell, a man of 63 who had inherited the property from his father Samuel in 1869. Thomas was a methodical farmer, the kind who kept detailed records of crop yields and livestock counts, attended the Methodist church in town every Sunday without fail, and had married late in life to a woman named Catherine, who was 20 years his junior. They had no children together, though Thomas had 2 adult sons from his first marriage, both of whom had moved west to Ohio and had little contact with their father. The relationship between Thomas and his sons had been strained for years, ever since the death of their mother in 1856. Thomas had remarried within 2 years, a decision his sons viewed as a betrayal of their mother's memory. The older son, William, had left for Ohio in 1860, taking a position as a clerk in a mercantile business in Columbus. The younger son, Robert, had followed 3 years later, seeking work in the growing industrial sector. Neither had returned to Pennsylvania for more than brief visits, and both made it clear they had little interest in inheriting the family farm. Catherine Hartwell was the kind of woman who drew attention without seeming to seek it. She was intelligent, well-read, and had come from a merchant family in Philadelphia before her marriage. Neighbors noted she seemed somewhat out of place in the rural community, kept to herself more than was typical, and had a peculiar habit of walking the property alone in the early mornings, often carrying a leather journal she would write in while sitting beneath the old oak trees. She was not unfriendly, but she was distant in a way that suggested her mind was always elsewhere. Something occupied her thoughts even as she performed the duties of a farmer's wife. Catherine had been married once before to a man named Richard Ashton, a lawyer from Philadelphia who had died in 1878 from complications related to pneumonia. The marriage had lasted only 4 years, and Catherine had been a widow for 7 years before marrying Thomas Hartwell. She had no children from her first marriage, and there was some speculation in the community about why a woman of her intelligence and apparent means had chosen to marry a rural farmer nearly 20 years her senior. Some suggested she had married for security, having been left with limited financial resources by her first husband. Others suggested she had married for companionship, having grown lonely in her widowhood. A few, more unkindly, suggested she had married because no other man of suitable standing would have her. The farmhouse itself was a two-story structure with a wraparound porch, the kind of home that looked both welcoming and somehow guarded. The interior was arranged in the typical fashion of the era: a large kitchen and dining area on the ground floor, a parlor for receiving guests, and several bedrooms upstairs. The cellar beneath the house was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, and there the family stored root vegetables, preserved goods, and the tools of their trade. The floorboards of the main living area were original to the house, worn smooth by decades of footsteps and maintained with regular oiling and careful sweeping. The kitchen itself was the heart of the house. It was a large room with a cast-iron stove installed in the 1860s, replacing the original fireplace. The walls were painted a pale cream color, and the windows looked out onto the eastern fields, where the morning sun would stream in during the early hours of the day. It was in this kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1887, that everything changed. That spring, a section of the kitchen floor near the eastern wall began to show signs of rot. The boards had started to warp, and there was a faint smell of dampness suggesting water damage from the spring thaw. The winter had been particularly harsh that year, with heavy snows and temperatures that had plunged well below freezing for extended periods. The spring thaw had been equally severe, with rapid snowmelt causing water to seep into the foundation and up through the floorboards. Thomas Hartwell, being a practical man, decided the boards would need replacing. He enlisted the help of a local carpenter named Henry Voss, a man in his early 40s who had done work on several homes in the area and was known for his meticulous attention to detail. Voss had built a reputation for honesty and craftsmanship, and he was one of the few tradesmen in the area who could command premium prices for his work. He had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, and the Voss family had been building and repairing homes in Lancaster County for 3 generations. Voss arrived at the Hartwell house on a Tuesday morning in late April, accompanied by his apprentice, a young man named William Clean, a descendant, as it happened, of the family who had owned the property before the Hartwells. William was 17 years old, the son of a local blacksmith, and had been apprenticed to Voss for just over a year. He was a quick learner, attentive to detail, and eager to master the trade. He was also, as it would turn out, the kind of young man who could not keep secrets. Catherine Hartwell seemed unusually anxious about the work. She hovered near the kitchen as the men began to pry up the damaged boards, asking repeatedly if they were certain they couldn't simply repair the existing floorboards rather than replace them. She offered to pay extra if they could avoid removing the boards entirely. Thomas, who was in the barn attending to his livestock, was not present to hear these concerns. He had left early that morning to check on a sick cow and would not return until late afternoon. Voss, accustomed to homeowners' worries about disruption and expense, assured Catherine that the boards would need replacing, that attempting repairs would only delay the inevitable, and that the sooner the work was done, the sooner the problem would be resolved. He was professional but firm, and Catherine seemed to accept his judgment, though her anxiety did not diminish. As Voss and his apprentice worked, they discovered something unexpected. Beneath the original floorboards, there was another layer, a second floor constructed from different wood and showing signs of age that suggested it had been there for decades. The space between the 2 floors was only about 8 inches deep, but it was enough to contain something. The wood of the lower floor was darker, more weathered, and showed signs of having been deliberately covered rather than simply abandoned. Voss called out to Catherine, asking if she knew about this hidden space. She came to the kitchen doorway, looked at the exposed space beneath the floorboards, and her face went very pale. She gripped the doorframe as if she needed it to support her weight. Without answering Voss's question, she turned and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, and the sound of the door locking behind her echoed through the house. William Clean, the apprentice, was the one who first reached into the space between the floors. He was young, curious, and not yet old enough to understand the weight of discretion. His hand emerged holding a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The fabric was yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. The oilcloth had been carefully folded and tied with twine that had long since hardened and become brittle. Inside the wrapping, there was clearly something substantial. Papers, it appeared, written documents of some kind. Voss took the bundle carefully from his apprentice's hands and began to unwrap it slowly, revealing layer after layer of yellowed oilcloth. Inside were documents, letters, it appeared, written in a careful hand on paper that had yellowed but remained legible. The ink had faded somewhat, but the words were still readable. Voss read the first letter in silence, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked at his apprentice and said simply, "We need to stop work. We need to tell Mr. Hartwell what we've found." But before they could leave the kitchen, Catherine Hartwell reappeared at the top of the stairs. She had changed her dress and composed herself, but her eyes were red-rimmed and her hands trembled slightly. She descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, and when she reached the kitchen floor, she looked directly at Henry Voss and said, "Those documents are private property. They belong to this household, and I must insist that you hand them over immediately." Voss, who was not a man easily intimidated, held the bundle firmly. "Mrs. Hartwell, if these documents contain evidence of something unlawful, they cannot remain private. I have a responsibility." "You have a responsibility to do the work you were hired to do," Catherine interrupted, her voice steady now, almost cold. "And that work is complete. I will pay you for your time, and I will expect your discretion regarding what you have found. What is in those documents is a family matter, nothing more." William Clean, sensing the tension, moved toward the door. But Voss remained where he stood, the bundle still in his hands. "I cannot in good conscience ignore what I've seen," he said quietly. "If there is wrongdoing, there is no wrongdoing," Catherine said. "There is only a family's attempt to protect itself from the judgment of people who would not understand the circumstances. I am asking you as a man of conscience to respect that." What happened next was a negotiation conducted in the tense silence of that kitchen, with the spring sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of old wood and damp earth filling the air. Voss looked at the bundle in his hands, then at Catherine's face, and something in her expression, not a threat, but a profound sadness, seemed to reach him. He asked her a single question: "Is anyone in danger?" Catherine took a long moment before answering. "No," she said finally. "No one is in danger. Not anymore." Voss wrapped the documents carefully and handed them back to Catherine. He told her he would complete the work on the floorboards, but that he would need to speak with her husband about the hidden space. Catherine nodded, accepting this condition. She took the bundle and held it against her chest like something precious and fragile. When Thomas Hartwell returned from the barn that afternoon, his boots muddy and his shirt stained with the work of the day, he found Henry Voss waiting for him in the kitchen. Catherine was nowhere to be seen. Voss told Thomas what had been discovered, speaking in a low voice and choosing his words carefully. He explained about the hidden space beneath the floorboards, about the documents wrapped in oilcloth, about Catherine's insistence that they be kept private. Thomas's reaction was not shock or anger, but a kind of weary resignation, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He sat down at the kitchen table without removing his boots, an unusual breach of etiquette that suggested his mind was elsewhere. He asked to see the documents, and Catherine, who had been listening from the parlor, emerged and handed them over without protest. Thomas read them in silence, sitting at the kitchen table while his wife stood nearby, watching him with an expression that was difficult to read. The documents were numerous. There were letters, some dating back to the 1860s, and there were also what appeared to be ledgers or account books filled with names and dates and cryptic notations. As Thomas read, his face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly, and at one point he closed his eyes as if the words on the pages were causing him physical pain. After he finished reading, Thomas Hartwell looked at Henry Voss and said, "I will pay you double your usual rate for your discretion in this matter. The work on the floorboards will continue, and you will speak to no one about what you have found. Is that understood?" Voss agreed, though he did so with visible reluctance. He was a man of principle, and the principle of keeping secrets about matters of potential wrongdoing sat uneasily with him. But he also understood the weight of what Thomas was asking, and he recognized that there were circumstances in which discretion was the more honorable course. The work was completed over the next 2 days. New floorboards were installed, carefully matched to the existing wood and finished to blend seamlessly with the surrounding floor. The hidden space was sealed beneath them, and to anyone who did not know what lay beneath, the kitchen floor looked exactly as it had before the work began. But the secret, once discovered, could not be so easily contained. William Clean, despite his youth and his desire to obey his employer, could not keep silent about what he had seen. He was young enough to believe that secrets of this magnitude should be shared, and he was curious enough to want to understand what he had witnessed. Within a week, he had told his mother, who told her sister, who told the wife of the Methodist minister. By the time a month had passed, half the county seemed to know that something unusual had been discovered beneath the Hartwell floorboards, though the specifics of what that something was remained frustratingly vague. The rumors that circulated were varied and increasingly elaborate. Some said Thomas Hartwell had hidden money beneath the floorboards, gold coins or paper currency he had been concealing from his creditors or from the tax assessor. Others suggested the documents were evidence of infidelity, that Catherine had been involved in some scandal before her marriage, and that Thomas had discovered proof of it. A few whispered that the hidden space contained evidence of a crime, a theft, perhaps, or something darker still. The Methodist minister, Reverend Samuel Pritchard, heard the rumors and felt obligated to investigate. He was a man in his 50s, educated and thoughtful, and had served the church in the area for nearly 20 years. He had known Thomas Hartwell for most of that time, and he had married Thomas and Catherine just 5 years earlier. He decided to visit the Hartwell farm and speak with Thomas directly about the matter. Thomas received the Reverend in his study, a room lined with books and papers, and was surprisingly forthcoming about the general nature of the discovery. He explained that documents had been found beneath the floorboards, documents that related to his father's activities during the Civil War. He did not elaborate on the specific contents of those documents, but he made it clear they were not evidence of any crime on his part, and that he was handling the matter with appropriate discretion. Reverend Pritchard left the farm somewhat reassured, but also troubled. He had the sense that Thomas was being truthful about the general nature of the discovery, but that there was something more, something Thomas was not saying, something that weighed heavily on his conscience. The Reverend decided not to spread rumors, but he also could not entirely dismiss his concerns. The Hartwell family responded to the broader rumors with a kind of dignified silence. Thomas and Catherine continued their routines as if nothing had changed. They attended church. They managed their farm. They received visitors with the same courtesy they had always shown. But there was a new tension in their interactions, a careful distance that had not been there before. Those who knew them well noticed that Catherine seemed to have withdrawn further into herself, that she spent even more time alone, walking the property with her journal. In the summer of 1887, a visitor arrived at the Hartwell farm who would change the trajectory of the story. His name was Edward Vance, and he was a lawyer from Philadelphia who claimed to be a distant relation of Catherine's family. He was a man in his late 50s, distinguished in appearance with grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. He arrived unannounced, traveling by train from Philadelphia and then hiring a carriage to bring him to the farm. Catherine's reaction to his arrival was one of shock followed by resignation. She greeted him formally, but there was an undercurrent of emotion in her voice that suggested she had not expected to see him again. She invited him into the house and offered him refreshment, then excused herself to inform Thomas of their visitor's arrival. Vance stayed for 3 weeks, and during that time he spent long hours in conversation with Thomas and Catherine, often in the study with the door closed. Neighbors who saw him arrive and depart noted that he looked troubled, that he seemed to carry a weight that grew heavier rather than lighter during his visit. He took walks around the property, sometimes alone and sometimes accompanied by Thomas or Catherine. He spent time in the study reading documents and making notes in a leather journal he carried with him. On the day before his departure, Vance met with Henry Voss, the carpenter, at the local tavern in town. He bought Voss a drink and asked him carefully and indirectly what he had seen beneath the floorboards. Voss refused to answer, citing the agreement he had made with Thomas Hartwell. But Vance persisted, and eventually he said something that made Voss reconsider his silence. "If what I suspect is true," Vance said, "then the documents beneath those floorboards are evidence of something that extends far beyond the Hartwell family. There are people who have a right to know the truth. There are people whose lives have been shaped by lies." Voss asked him what he meant, but Vance would not elaborate. He left the tavern that evening and returned to Philadelphia. And Voss was left with a growing sense of unease about the decision he had made to remain silent. It was not until the winter of 1888, nearly a year after the discovery, that the full story began to emerge. The catalyst was an unexpected death. Samuel Hartwell, Thomas's older brother, died in his home in Ohio under circumstances officially ruled as natural causes, heart failure brought on by pneumonia. But in his will, Samuel left a letter to be opened by his brother Thomas. And in that letter, he revealed that he had always known about the hidden space beneath the farmhouse floorboards. Samuel's letter explained that the documents hidden there had been placed there by their father, Samuel Hartwell Sr., in the years following the Civil War. The elder Samuel had been involved in activities during the war that he had wished to conceal from his family and from the law. The nature of those activities, Samuel Jr. wrote, was something Thomas would need to confront because the documents contained evidence that would eventually come to light, and Thomas needed to be prepared for the consequences. Samuel Jr. also wrote that he had carried the burden of this knowledge for many years, and that he had often wondered whether he should have revealed the truth to Thomas earlier, but he had respected their father's wishes, and he had believed Thomas would eventually discover the truth on his own. Now that Samuel Jr. was dying, he felt obligated to ensure that Thomas understood the full weight of what lay beneath the floorboards and that he was prepared to make the right decision about what to do with that knowledge. When Thomas received this letter, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He contacted Edward Vance in Philadelphia and asked him to come to the farm once more. When Vance arrived, Thomas handed him the documents from beneath the floorboards and told him he was releasing them from the condition of secrecy. He asked only that Vance handle the matter with discretion and that he ensure the truth, whatever it was, would be preserved accurately. Edward Vance spent a week at the Hartwell farm reading the documents carefully and taking notes. He consulted with Thomas and Catherine about the contents, asking questions and seeking clarification on points that were unclear. He also interviewed Henry Voss, the carpenter, asking him what he had observed and what he had understood about the nature of the documents. Voss, now released from his obligation to remain silent, provided detailed information about what he had seen and what Catherine had said to him on that day in April. When Vance finished his review of the documents, he sat down with Thomas and Catherine and explained what he had found. The documents, he said, were letters and records that detailed the activities of Samuel Hartwell Sr. during the Civil War. The elder Samuel had been involved in what was known as the Underground Railroad, but not in the way history books typically portrayed it. Samuel Hartwell Sr. had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, yes, but he had also been something more complicated. During the war years, he had sheltered escaped enslaved people on his property, providing them with food, clothing, and safe passage to the North. This was not unusual for a man of his abolitionist sympathies in Pennsylvania. What was unusual, and what had required such careful concealment, was that he had also been involved in a scheme to forge documents, freedom papers, passes, and other official-looking certificates that would allow people to travel more safely through hostile territory. The documents beneath the floorboards included detailed records of how many people had been helped, where they had come from, and where they had been sent. There were also letters from people who had been assisted expressing their gratitude and describing their new lives in the North and in Canada. But there were also letters from people who had been betrayed, who had been captured and returned to slavery despite the papers Samuel had provided, who had been separated from family members and lost in the chaos of the war. More troubling still, there were records suggesting that Samuel Hartwell Sr. had not always been entirely honest about the fate of those he claimed to have helped. Some of the people who had passed through his farm had never been heard from again. There were no letters, no confirmation that they had reached safety, and in a few cases, there were cryptic notes in Samuel's handwriting suggesting that certain individuals had posed a threat to the operation, to the community, or to the Hartwell family itself. One entry dated in the summer of 1863 read, "The man calling himself James arrived 3 days ago, claiming to be from Virginia. His story is consistent with what we have heard from others, but there is something about him that troubles me. He asks too many questions about our methods, about how we move people north, about who else is involved in the operation. I have decided that it is not safe to help him further. I have given him money and directed him to another station, but I fear that he may be a spy sent by the authorities to infiltrate our network." Another entry from the spring of 1864 was even more cryptic. "The woman and her child departed yesterday. I had hoped that they would reach safety, but I have received word that they were apprehended near the Maryland border. The child was taken from her and sold to a plantation in Georgia. I do not know what became of the woman. I carry the weight of this failure, and I wonder whether I made the right decision in helping them at all. Perhaps it would have been better to refuse them, to tell them that the journey was too dangerous, that their chances of success were too slim. But how could I have done that? How could I have looked into the eyes of a mother desperate to save her child, and told her that I could not help?" Edward Vance explained to Thomas that the documents were historically significant. They provided a detailed account of Underground Railroad operations in Pennsylvania during a critical period, but they also raised questions that could not be easily answered. Had Samuel Hartwell Sr. been responsible for the disappearance of those individuals whose fates were unclear? Had he been involved in something darker than the noble work of helping enslaved people escape to freedom? Or had he simply been a man trying to do good in impossible circumstances, and had the documents been preserved as a record of both his successes and his failures? Thomas Hartwell listened to this explanation with a face that revealed nothing. When Vance finished, Thomas asked a single question: "What do you intend to do with this information?" Vance said he believed the documents should be preserved and eventually made available to historians, but that he understood the sensitivity of the matter. He was willing to wait to allow Thomas time to decide how the family wished to proceed. He suggested that the documents could be donated to a historical society or a university where they would be preserved and studied, but where the family's privacy could also be respected. Catherine, who had been silent throughout this conversation, spoke for the first time. "My husband's father did what he believed was right," she said quietly. "He helped people who were suffering. If there are questions about his methods or his judgment, those are questions that history will have to answer. But I do not believe that hiding the truth serves anyone. I believe that the documents should be preserved, and I believe that the story should be told even if it is complicated and even if it reflects poorly on our family." Thomas looked at his wife for a long moment and then he nodded. He told Vance that he was willing to allow the documents to be preserved and studied, but that he asked for one condition: that the documents not be made public during his lifetime or Catherine's lifetime. After their deaths, he said, the documents could be released to whoever wished to study them. Vance agreed to this condition, and he took the documents with him when he left the farm. He deposited them with a historical society in Philadelphia with instructions that they were to be sealed and preserved until after the deaths of Thomas and Catherine Hartwell. The years that followed the discovery were marked by a kind of quiet resignation in the Hartwell household. Thomas and Catherine continued their lives much as they had before, but there was a new understanding between them, a shared knowledge of a truth they could not speak about openly. The rumors in the community gradually faded, replaced by other gossip and other scandals. The Hartwell family was no longer the subject of intense speculation, though people still wondered, still whispered, still tried to piece together what had been hidden beneath those floorboards. In 1889, Thomas Hartwell received a letter from his son William in Ohio. William had heard rumors about the discovery at the farm, and he was writing to ask his father directly what had been found. Thomas responded with a carefully worded letter that explained in general terms that documents relating to his father's activities during the Civil War had been discovered, and that these documents were being preserved for historical purposes. He did not elaborate, and he did not invite further discussion of the matter. William, sensing his father's reluctance to discuss the subject, did not press the issue. Robert, the younger son, did not even inquire about the matter. He had long since distanced himself from his father and from the farm, and he had little interest in family history or family secrets. He was building a life for himself in Ohio, working in the industrial sector, and he had married and started a family of his own. He had no desire to return to Pennsylvania or to reconnect with his father. In 1891, Thomas Hartwell suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He recovered enough to move about the house with assistance, but his days of managing the farm were over. Catherine became the primary caretaker and also took on the responsibilities of running the property. She hired a manager to oversee the agricultural work and devoted herself to her husband's care with a dedication that impressed even those who had previously found her distant and cold. The manager she hired was a man named George Thorne, a farmer in his 50s who had worked on several properties in the area and who had a reputation for honesty and competence. Thorne lived in a cottage on the property and managed the day-to-day operations of the farm while Catherine handled the financial and administrative aspects. The arrangement worked well, and the farm continued to be productive despite Thomas's illness. During this period, Catherine's journal entries, which would not be discovered until after her death, reveal a woman wrestling with profound questions about truth, responsibility, and the nature of historical memory. She wrote about her husband's father, about the people he had helped, about the people he had failed. She wrote about the burden of knowing a secret that could not be shared, about the weight of history pressing down on a family that had tried to do good but had perhaps not always succeeded. One entry dated in the spring of 1892 reads, "I have been thinking about the people whose names appear in those documents, the ones whose fates are unknown. Are they alive somewhere, living lives that they built for themselves? Or did they perish victims of circumstances beyond anyone's control? We will never know. And perhaps that is the cruelest aspect of this history. Not the secrets themselves, but the unknowing that comes with them. We are left to wonder forever about the lives we touched and the lives we failed to save." Another entry from the summer of 1893 reveals Catherine's internal conflict about the decision to preserve the documents. "I have been wondering whether we did the right thing in allowing the documents to be preserved. Thomas believes that history should know the truth, even if that truth is complicated and even if it reflects poorly on his father. I agree with him. But I also understand the desire to protect one's family from judgment. Perhaps both things can be true at once. Perhaps we can honor the truth while also honoring the memory of those who struggled to do right in impossible circumstances." In 1894, Thomas Hartwell died. He was 70 years old, and his death was attributed to complications from his earlier stroke. Catherine was left as the sole surviving member of the household, and she continued to manage the farm with the help of George Thorne. She was now a woman in her 50s, still intelligent and capable, but increasingly isolated from the community that had never quite accepted her. It was during this period that Catherine began to receive visitors, historians and researchers who had somehow learned of the documents hidden beneath the floorboards and sought her out, hoping to gain access to them. Catherine refused all such requests, citing the agreement her husband had made with Edward Vance. But she did speak with some of these visitors and shared what she could about the history of the Hartwell family and the work that Thomas's father had done. One of these visitors was a young historian named Margaret Ashton, who came to the farm in the summer of 1896. Ashton was researching the history of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania and had heard rumors about the Hartwell documents. She had written to Catherine requesting an interview, and to her surprise, Catherine had agreed. Margaret Ashton was a woman in her early 30s, educated and intelligent, with a genuine passion for historical research. She had published several articles on the history of the Underground Railroad and was working on a book that would examine the experiences of conductors and the complex moral questions they had faced. She had heard about the Hartwell documents through her research network and believed they could provide valuable insights into the operations of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. Catherine was initially reluctant to speak with Ashton, but something about Ashton's genuine interest and her respectful approach seemed to move Catherine. Over the course of a week-long visit, Catherine told Ashton much of what she knew about the documents and about the history they contained. She did not show Ashton the documents themselves. She could not, given the agreement with Edward Vance, but she described their contents in detail and answered Ashton's questions as fully as she could. Ashton asked Catherine directly, "Do you believe that your husband's father was a good man?" Catherine took a long time to answer. "I believe he was a man who tried to do good in circumstances that were often impossible," she said finally. "I believe he helped people who desperately needed help. I also believe that he made decisions that may have caused harm, even if that was not his intention. I believe that history is rarely as simple as we would like it to be, and that the people who shape history are rarely as purely good or purely evil as we would like them to be. My husband's father was all of these things, a hero and a flawed human being, sometimes simultaneously." Margaret Ashton published an article about the Hartwell family in a historical journal in 1897 based on what Catherine had told her. The article did not reveal the specific contents of the documents, but it did discuss the general nature of the Hartwell family's involvement with the Underground Railroad and raised questions about the complexity of that historical period. The article was titled "The Moral Ambiguity of the Underground Railroad: One Family's Struggle with Conscience and Consequence," and it was read by a small audience of academics and historians. The article generated some interest in academic circles and led to several inquiries about the Hartwell documents. But Catherine continued to refuse all requests for access, and the documents remained sealed in the Historical Society in Philadelphia. Another visitor came to the farm in the winter of 1898. His name was James Whitmore, and he was a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. Whitmore was interested in the Hartwell documents because he was researching the role of forged documents in the Underground Railroad and believed the Hartwell records could provide valuable insights into this aspect of the operation. Catherine agreed to speak with Whitmore and provided him with information about the nature of the documents and the work that Samuel Hartwell Sr. had done. Whitmore was particularly interested in the ethical questions raised by the forging of documents and asked Catherine whether she believed such forgery was justified even in service of a noble cause. Catherine's response was thoughtful and nuanced. "I believe that my husband's father faced impossible choices," she said. "He could have refused to help people who were seeking freedom, but that would have meant condemning them to slavery. He could have helped them without forging documents, but that would have greatly increased the danger they faced. He chose to forge documents because he believed this was the best way to help people escape to freedom. Whether that choice was justified is a question that each person must answer for themselves based on their own moral framework and their understanding of the circumstances." Whitmore left the farm impressed by Catherine's thoughtfulness and her willingness to engage with difficult moral questions. He did not publish anything about the Hartwell documents, but he did mention them in his lectures and encouraged his students to think carefully about the moral complexities of the Underground Railroad. Catherine Hartwell died in the winter of 1903 at the age of 68. She had been in declining health for several years, and her death was not unexpected. In her will, she left the farm to a distant cousin and her personal effects, including her journal, to Margaret Ashton, the historian who had visited her years before. Ashton received the journal and Catherine's letters with a sense of profound responsibility. She read through Catherine's private thoughts, her struggles with the secret she had carried, her reflections on history and truth, and the burden of knowing things that could not be shared. And she made a decision that would have significant consequences for the historical record. In 1905, 2 years after Catherine's death, Ashton contacted the Historical Society in Philadelphia where the Hartwell documents had been deposited. She informed them that both Thomas and Catherine Hartwell were now deceased, and she asked that the documents be released so they could be properly studied and preserved. The Historical Society, after consulting with Edward Vance, who was still alive though now in his 80s, agreed to release the documents. The documents were made available to researchers in 1906 and immediately attracted significant attention from historians studying the Civil War and the Underground Railroad. Scholars began to analyze the records, cross-reference them with other historical sources, and piece together a more complete picture of the Hartwell family's activities during the war years. What emerged from this research was a complex and sometimes troubling portrait of Samuel Hartwell Sr. and his work. It became clear that he had indeed helped many people escape from slavery and that his work had been significant and courageous. But it also became clear that some of the people he had claimed to help had never reached their intended destinations and that the circumstances of their disappearances remained mysterious. Some historians suggested these individuals had been captured by slave catchers and returned to the South, a tragic but not uncommon outcome of escape attempts. Others suggested they had simply moved on, lost to history, their fates unknown. A few, more speculatively, suggested that Samuel Hartwell Sr. might have been involved in something more sinister, though they acknowledged that the evidence for such a claim was circumstantial at best. The documents also revealed that Samuel Hartwell Sr. had kept detailed financial records of his Underground Railroad activities, including payments he had received for his work. This raised questions about whether his motivations had been purely humanitarian or whether he had been profiting from the desperation of enslaved people seeking freedom. Again, historians debated the significance of this finding, with some arguing it was entirely reasonable for someone to be compensated for the significant risks and expenses involved in such work, and others suggesting it complicated the narrative of pure altruism. As the decades passed and the 20th century progressed, the Hartwell documents became an important resource for historians, but they also became a source of ongoing debate and speculation. The documents themselves were clear and detailed, but they raised as many questions as they answered. The people who had disappeared, whose names appeared in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s records but who were never heard from again, became a kind of historical mystery, a puzzle that researchers tried to solve but never quite could. In the 1960s, a researcher named David Brenner became obsessed with the Hartwell documents. He spent years trying to trace the fates of the individuals whose disappearances were recorded in Samuel's notes. He traveled to the South, searching through slave auction records and plantation documents. He interviewed descendants of enslaved people, trying to find any mention of individuals who matched the names in the Hartwell records. He consulted with other historians, comparing notes and theories. Brenner's research was meticulous and thorough, but it ultimately yielded more questions than answers. He found evidence that some of the missing individuals had indeed been captured and returned to slavery. He found evidence that others had successfully reached the North and had established lives there, though they had left no record of their journey. And for a few, he found no evidence at all, no trace of them in any historical record, no indication of what had become of them. In his final publication on the subject, Brenner wrote, "The Hartwell documents provide us with a window into the operations of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania during the Civil War era. They also provide us with a mystery that may never be fully solved." The disappearances recorded in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s notes may have been the result of capture and return to slavery, of successful escape and assimilation into northern communities, or of death from disease, accident, or other causes. Without additional evidence, we cannot determine which of these fates befell the missing individuals. What we can say with certainty is that their names were recorded, that they were real people whose lives mattered, and that their stories deserve to be remembered, even if the details of their fates remain unknown. The Hartwell farmhouse itself remained standing for many decades after the family's involvement with it had ended. The property changed hands several times, passing through the hands of various owners who knew nothing of its history or who knew only vague rumors about hidden documents and family secrets. The house was maintained reasonably well, though like all old structures, it gradually showed signs of age and wear. In the 1970s, the house was purchased by a historical preservation society, which recognized its significance and began a careful restoration project. During this restoration, workers discovered additional evidence of the hidden space beneath the floorboards. They found traces of the original construction, marks on the joists that suggested how the false floor had been installed, and fragments of the oilcloth that had wrapped the documents. They also found something else. A small compartment in the cellar wall, hidden behind a loose stone that contained a single letter written in a hand that matched Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s handwriting. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this and was dated 1868, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. In it, Samuel Hartwell Sr. explained his reasons for hiding the documents beneath the floorboards. He wrote that he had been involved in work he believed was morally justified, but that he also recognized his methods had not always been pure, that he had made decisions he regretted, and that he had failed some of the people who had depended on him. "I am placing these documents where they will be found," he wrote. "Not because I wish to hide them forever, but because I believe that the truth about what occurred during these years is too complicated and too painful to be revealed while I am alive. I hope that future generations, with the benefit of time and distance, will be able to understand not just what I did but why I did it, and will be able to judge my actions with a measure of compassion and understanding. I also hope that they will remember the people whose names appear in these documents, the people I helped and the people I failed, and that they will understand that history is not always a simple story of good and evil, but rather a complex tapestry of human choices, human failures, and human struggles." The letter continued with a more personal reflection. "I have lived with the weight of my decisions for many years now. I have asked myself countless times whether I did enough, whether I could have done more, whether I made the right choices in the moments when I had to decide. I do not have answers to these questions. What I do know is that I tried. I tried to help people who were suffering, and I tried to do so in a way that would maximize their chances of reaching safety. I also know that I failed sometimes, that my efforts were not always successful, and that people suffered as a result of my failures. This knowledge will stay with me until the end of my days." The letter was preserved along with the other documents and became one of the most poignant pieces of evidence in the Hartwell archive. It suggested that Samuel Hartwell Sr. had been aware of the moral complexity of his own actions, that he had understood the weight of the decisions he had made, and that he had hoped future generations would be able to understand his story in all its complexity. Today, the Hartwell farmhouse stands as a museum and historical site, open to visitors who wish to learn about the history of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania and about the Hartwell family's role in that history. The floorboards have been carefully preserved, and visitors can see the space where the documents were hidden, can walk on the same boards that Thomas and Catherine Hartwell walked on, can stand in the kitchen where Henry Voss made the discovery that changed everything. The documents themselves are housed in a climate-controlled archive, where they are preserved for future generations of researchers. Historians continue to study them, continue to debate their significance, continue to try to piece together the stories of the people whose names appear in Samuel Hartwell Sr.'s records. But the mystery remains. The people who disappeared, whose names were recorded but whose fates were never confirmed, continue to haunt the historical record. Were they captured and returned to slavery? Did they escape and build new lives in the North? Did they perish along the way? The documents do not tell us, and perhaps they never will. What we do know is that the Hartwell family made a choice to hide the truth, and that this choice had consequences that rippled through generations. We know that Thomas Hartwell inherited a secret that was not his own, that he carried it with him until his death, and that he ultimately chose to release it so that history could be preserved and studied. We know that Catherine Hartwell struggled with the burden of knowing a truth that could not be shared, and that she ultimately supported the decision to let the documents be revealed. And we know that beneath the floorboards of an ordinary farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, there lay a second layer not just of wood and nails, but of history, of secrets, of human choices and human failures, of the complicated legacy of a nation trying to reckon with the sin of slavery and the courage of those who resisted it. The story of the Hartwell family reminds us that history is not always as simple as we would like it to be. It reminds us that the people who shape history are often flawed, often struggling with moral questions that have no easy answers, often making decisions that have unintended consequences. It reminds us that the truth, when it is finally revealed, is often more complicated and more troubling than the rumors and speculation that preceded it. But it also reminds us that the truth matters. It reminds us that the stories of ordinary people, the people whose names appear in historical documents, The people who lived through extraordinary times and made choices that echoed through generations deserve to be remembered and studied and understood. It reminds us that history is not just about great events and famous figures, but about the choices made by individuals in their homes and communities, choices that had consequences far beyond what they could have imagined. The Hartwell documents remain one of the most important sources for understanding the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. They provide us with names, dates, and details that help us reconstruct the lives of people who were seeking freedom. They also provide us with a mystery, the mystery of the people who disappeared, whose fates remain unknown, whose stories are incomplete. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is not a closed book. It is an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, a constant effort to understand the people who came before us, to honor their struggles and their sacrifices, and to learn from their choices and their failures. The documents beneath the Hartwell floorboards are part of that conversation, and they will continue to speak to future generations long after everyone who knew the Hartwell family has passed away. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the truth should always be revealed, no matter how complicated or troubling it might be? Or do you think there are times when secrets should be kept, when the burden of knowing the truth is too great to bear? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries and history. See you in the next.